Hey guys, tonight we step past the velvet curtains of royal bedchambers and look straight at a truth that smells nothing like roses. Syphilis once lurked right beneath the crown. Right now, imagine thick layers of cosmetics trying to hide ulcerations, fever smouldering beneath silk, memories fraying as the nervous system is attacked. 5 figures at the summit of power were still brought down by a disease that spares no one. Some fell into mental collapse. Others saw their marriages break apart. And still others dragged entire lines of succession into crisis. And the treatments of the day, rubbing in mercury to sweat it out, steaming until collapse, swallowing iodide and harsh concoctions, just hearing it already makes the tongue sting. Yet the results were half measures at best. And sometimes worse. I'll tell it slowly. But every scene prickles. If you feel a little faint, you won't survive this. Now, we will move, one by one, through 5 portraits cleanly and candidly into the secrets that history left behind the velvet drapes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. End of entry. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you live. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Syphilis, a silent killer, a disfiguring curse, a disease that slipped through palace walls and quietly rotted empires from within. It does not bow to the crown, nor the fair to noble blood, behind resplendent portraits. Beneath soft silks and gilded thrones lie fractured minds, decaying bodies, loveless marriages, and hidden infections. This model story follows 5 royal figures who suffered from syphilis, revealing private secrets and the price each person and each dynasty had to pay. Before we enter the individual portraits, a common backdrop appears: the clash between ceremonial splendor and harsh biological reality, the ignorance of pre-antibiotic medicine, outbreaks masked by incense, ritual, and face-saving proclamations. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, from Safavid Persia and Restoration England to Braganza Portugal and the Habsburg Empire, the same backstage theme repeats: pleasure, adultery, harems, mistresses, and then the consequences: infertility, depression, neurological collapse, sudden deaths, and political tragedy. Each portrait below is not only a medical history, but also a mirror held up to power. When the body of the one at the top is harmed, legacy and succession tremble. With a slow, gentle cadence, we will pass through 5 fates, 1 part per person to keep the bedtime mood intact. Soft, yet fully detailed, as in the model. On the pre-antibiotic medical plane, syphilis was a stubborn, sexually transmitted disease that could lie dormant for many years and then erupt violently. It is estimated that about 1/3 of untreated individuals would progress to late stages with neurological, cardiovascular, or dermato-osteo soft tissue complications. The nervous system could be ravaged, causing personality change, memory decline, Zeitzuras, and even paralysis. Before antibiotics appeared in the early 1940s, the mainstays of therapy were mercury, iodide, steaming and overheating regimens, and harsh concoctions, costly, painful, of shaky efficacy, and often leaving serious sequelae. In royal courts, the veil of face and honor meant the disease was often renamed, concealed, or dismissed as nervous exhaustion, pushing sufferers deeper into isolation and confusion. Slow deaths and mental ruin cast a long shadow over entire families. The 5 figures in this story span the 17th to the 19th centuries, each with distinct circumstances, yet sharing a common risk: high likelihood of transmission within complex erotic networks Luís I of Portugal, born in 1838, a scholar king of the Braganza line, loved literature and languages. A private life rich in affairs drew him into the net of contagion. After a quiet interval, neurosyphilis flared in 1887 depression, headaches, Zeitzures, cognitive decline. He died in 1889 at age 50, leaving a broken marriage and a shadowed throne. Shah Abbas, the second of Safavid Persia, born in 1632, began as a prudent ruler, avoiding great wars, then slid into luxury, drink, and a vast harem. By 1666, he died at just 34. With late-stage signs that left body and mind depleted, Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria-Hungary, born in 1858, grew up amid trauma and instability, plunged into drink and risky affairs. He contracted both gonorrhea and syphilis and infected his wife, Princess Stephanie of Belgium. The mailing incident in 1889 closed his life at 30 in a shattering tragedy. While the court announced bland causes to preserve honour, John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, born in 1647, a satirist and libertine of Restoration England. In the end, syphilis destroyed his body, nasal collapse, blindness, loss of urinary control. He died in 1680 at 33. Joseph I, Holy Roman Emperor, born in 1678, was famed for his amours. Rumour held he contracted syphilis and passed it to Empress Wilhelmina Amalia, rendering her infertile and pushing the Habsburgs into a succession crisis. He died young in 1711 at 32, leaving a liminal political legacy and prolonged disputes over inheritance. Why did they contract this disease? The common denominator was dense yet hidden sexual networks, harems with many concubines, extramarital affairs, an elite culture that exalted pleasure, and hunting trips and banquets that lasted for days, combined with limited medical understanding and no effective protective measures. Syphilis easily hid behind rumour, the habit of renaming illness, and the obsession with saving face. In several cases, the spouse became an invisible victim. Princess Stephanie was infected and permanently lost fertility. Wilhelmina Amalia carried the disease yet was still expected to produce a prince. When those at the apex of a dynasty were infected, the shock did not stop at the bedchamber. It shattered marriages, unsettled the order of succession, and even contributed to political crises. Viewed through the lens of classical statistics, the picture grows colder. About 1/3 of untreated patients progress to tertiary disease. Within that group, a portion develop neurological complications with depression, personality change, and seizures. A significant proportion suffer cardiovascular complications such as aortic aneurysm, and not a small number die from complications or prolonged decline. Before antibiotics, even successful treatments had high relapse rates, while failures left long-lasting mental physical scars. Thus the names above: Luís I, Abbas II, Rudolf, John Wilmot, Joseph I are not merely medical portraits. They are intersections between finite bodies and seemingly boundless power. And when syphilis touches that intersection, consequences echo beyond a single lifetime. From a sore hidden beneath powder, an entire dynasty can slip into an unnamed dusk. This opening lays the track for what follows. Each subsequent part will proceed very slowly, very gently, separating each story from Portugal to Persia, from Vienna to London to show, through small details, how an invisible disease rewrote the fate of the crown. Before we enter sealed harems and silent verdicts, we pause in Lisbon. The first in our top 5 is King Luís, I of Portugal, 1838, 1889. The scholar king, who adored Shakespeare and loved the rustle of paper more than the cheers of courtiers. Yet amid translated pages and letters sent across Europe, the seed of illness slipped into his life. After the outbreak of 1861, the throne arrived too soon. While syphilis lay in wait until 1887 before striking directly at his brain and nervous system. From a study-bound prince to a king fading in silence, we begin the story here. Number 1. King Luís I of Portugal, 1838, 1889. After Pedro V, the eldest brother wore the crown at the age of 16 and then died in the outbreak of 1861, possibly typhoid or cholera. Together with the deaths of the two younger brothers, Fernando and João, King Luís I of Portugal was forced to ascend the throne amid the Braganza dynasty's succession crisis. Before that, the prince lived a tranquil dream, immersed in books, learning languages, translating Shakespeare into Portuguese. His gift for speech helped him win many hearts. In those days, the rustle of paper, the scent of fresh ink, and finely wrought lines of verse felt safer than any courtly ritual. An inward-looking spirit, a mind that loved gathering light from the page, and a heart easily moved by the beauty of words. When upheaval struck, a new priority came into sharp focus: to find a suitable marriage to secure an heir. For the dynasty needed a newborn's cry to muffle the tolling of funeral bells. King Luís I of Portugal wrote to Queen Victoria and to King Leopold, the first seeking advice on a match. Maria Theresa of Austria was suggested, but her father refused because she was only 16, and political calculations as well as family misgivings were not ready for such a binding step. In the end, King Luís I of Portugal married Maria Pia of Savoy, the 14-year-old Italian princess. Maria Pia was enamored of her gifted husband. By the time she turned 18, she had borne 2 princes and fully embraced the role of a young mother, gentle and proud. The court had its formal reviews, candelier banquet, and splendid portraits, and amid all that ceremony lay a simple hope: a whole family, une durable line, a dynasty steady against storms. But behind the scenes, cracks began to show. King Luís I of Portugal continued his affairs, especially with the actress Rosa de Lima. Fleeting meetings turned into rumour, and whispered letters became a late night knocking in the Queen's mind. Maria Pia, in sorrow, sometimes left Lisbon for long stretches, seeking a little peace on other coasts and in other residences, and then, as in every courtly tale, she herself was linked to rumours of an affair, perhaps true, perhaps not, yet enough to etch another scratch into the crystal vessel called marriage. Within that web of love affairs, King Luís I of Portugal contracted syphilis. At first the disease lay still, like a stranger treading lightly down a corridor, leaving behind the cold scent of unease that no one would name. Years passed. The court still functioned. People still laughed beneath carved ceilings. Ceremonies still kept time. But in a hidden corner, the clock was quietly counting down. By 1887, syphilis flared into neurosyphilis. Depression dragged the mind to the bottom. Flashes of irritability flared and died like sparks before a storm. Headaches struck like hammers at the temples. Seizures sent the body reeling. And cognitive decline quietly pulled thread after thread from the fabric of a once refined spirit. King Luís I of Portugal, the scholar king of letters and language, became a shadow of himself. Decisions grew harder. Conversations fewer. His eyes dodging the blaze of chandeliers in the great hall. Queen Maria Pia noticed every small change. A sentence left unfinished. A page folded too soon. A sleepless night stretching until dawn. The court preferred euphemism: exhaustion, fatigue, needs rest. polite words lined up to cover a medical truth no one dared to name. And then, as in all stories from the pre-antibiotic years, treatment amounted only to desperate measures. Mercury, iodide, steaming things that seemed violent to the body were taken as a way out. Results were half measures. While sequelae clung to the days like a sad habit, King Luís I of Portugal still appeared at necessary ceremonies, still kept the posture of a sovereign, yet each step added a rest. Each smile, another hairline crack, when the headaches stretched on, when a sudden seizure forced the monarch to grip the banister, when memory forgot the details that had once brought joy, translating a line of verse. Recalling a line of Shakespeare, it became clear that the throne was no refuge for the body. The marriage already fractured could not bear more storms. The distance between the two grew, and at long dinners perhaps only the clink of knife and fork against the plate remained honest. In 1889, King Luís I of Portugal died at the age of 50. The court issued elegant phrases. The funeral proceeded with all the rites the crown demands. But what remained afterward was more than a line in a chronicle. It was the sorrowful story of a broken marriage, of a young wife aged by tears, of two princes growing up under a clouded roof, and of a throne tied to a disease unnamed before the public, a secret everyone knew, but no one spoke aloud. King Luís I of Portugal went from a study-bound prince to a king who faded in silence, leaving behind folded pages of Shakespeare, half-finished letters, and a small but deep scratch on the mirror of power, that the body of the one at the top can fail like any other. And when it does, a legacy loses not only a person, but also a portion of faith in the crown's supposed invincibility. Leaving Lisbon, we head for Isfahan. If, with King Luís I of Portugal, illness hid behind books and ceremony, then in Persia, it lurked beneath the music of banquets and brimming cups of wine. Before us stands Shah Abbas, the second of Safavid Persia, a monarch who took the throne at a very young age. He was once praised for calm governance, yet also became known for luxury, drink, and a vast harem where the risk of contagion slipped between layers of silk. From the study of a scholar king in Lisbon, our story carries us into the forbidden quarters of the East, where pleasure and power coil tightly around disease. Please step into the second portrait. 2. King Shah Abbas II, 1632-1666. Born in 1632, Abbas II ascended the throne at only 9 years old, and by 15 he had removed his father's Grand Vizier to rule on his own. In the early phase, he governed with sobriety, avoiding war with the Ottomans, winning limited successes against the Mughals and the Russians, and cultivating an image of fairness and tolerance. Persia enjoyed a rare interval of peace, but the darker side gradually surfaced. Abbas relished luxury, wine, and women. Banquets overflowed with music and drink, to the point that he sipped from a golden cup set with rubies, a gift from the Tsar of Russia. When the imperial economy faltered, instead of reform, he sank deeper into private pleasures. After nights of debauchery, he would disappear from public affairs for weeks at a time. His vast harem included many concubines taken from conquered lands, a complex structure of power and bodies where sexually transmitted disease could spread in silence. It is unclear when he contracted syphilis, but by 1666, late-stage signs brought body and mind to collapse at the age of 34. Strength spent, spirit unraveled, derelict in the vortex of pleasure and illness. That year, the revelry ended for good. Abbas II died of syphilis, leaving a waning empire to his successor. His story, as the model text coldly indicates, lays bare the price of a court that gilds over crisis. When the ruler retreats into pleasure, disease not only consumes the body, but also rots the will to govern. and the chain of decision-making, pushing the realm to the brink from the first days of his rule, when a teenager let go of a regent's hand early and signed edicts himself. The outline of a deft ruler appeared. He avoided major clashes with the Ottomans and accepted provisional calm along the borders. Against the Mughals and the Russians, he stopped at limited victories to buy breathing room for merchants and peasants. His court spoke with restraint. Edicts praised tolerance, and people felt the scales of justice a bit more balanced. Yet alongside that steady bureaucratic drumbeat, strings were already sounding backstage. The empire's treasure was poured into banquets, where wine shimmered and praise piled upon praise. The golden cup, set with rubies, a token of diplomatic goodwill, became a familiar prop on long nights. As food prices crept up and the money supply turned erratic, Abbas II did not choose the sweat of reform. He chose the sweat of the steam room. Strong drink, and bodies, after each bout of revelry. Statecraft fell into silent mode like a muted clock, and the treasury gained another scratch. The harem swelled to the rhythm of spoils. Women seized from conquered lands crossed the threshold without a voice, becoming links in a machine of pleasure and power. There, a body did not belong solely to the person. It was managed, arranged, and circulated at the king's will, and by invisible rules, in precisely that space. Disease had every condition to germinate. Dense contact, absolute imbalances of power, and a veil of secrecy that caused symptoms to be called by other names. At first, syphilis might have been only faint marks on the skin, a fever that passed quickly, a vague ache. But when the man at the top did not stop, the circle of contact kept widening, and the invisible seed had ever more chances to take root. By 1666, when late-stage signs became evident, there was nothing left to hide. Abbas II's strength ebbed from his body like the receding tide. His spirit slackened. Revels turned hollow, and governance became a sketch missing its lines. Neurosyphilis can strike memory, blurring maps and ledgers once known by heart. It can push temperament to extremes buoyant today, desolate tomorrow, making even a signature feel heavy as lead. A headache can pound at the temples longer than a single audience. A tremor can turn handwriting ragged. A vacant moment can wash a minister's words away like water. Nights of debauchery that once brought a sense of omnipotence now left only emptiness. And when the velvet curtain fell, a spent body sat alone before the mirror. In a system where all eyes look up to the throne for answers, each pause from the king lengthened into a waiting period for the entire court. Then the chain of decisions broke. Officials fell back on habit rather than principle, and people sensed, in markets and fields, tremors that had no easy name. The death of Abbas II at the age of 34 closed a chapter half bright, half dark, the first half a reel of a ruler who could restrain conflict. The second, a slow-motion scene of a man carried off by the whirl of pleasure and disease. The empire was handed on in decline, not collapsing with thunder, but sinking like a boat taking on water. And his story, as the model notes, is a cold warning about the cost of a court that covers crisis with gold. The more gold, the deeper the crack, the more music, the clearer the sound of splitting. When the one in power withdraws into pleasure, disease not only erodes the body, but also hollows out the will to rule and the decision chain, pushing the edifice to the cliff's edge. There, a gust of wind can unsettle an entire wall, and when the velvet falls, what remains is not the fragrance of wine, but the cold metallic smell of truth, that a neglected body will always come to collect its debt, whether its owner wears a crown or not. Leaving Isfahan, we return to Europe. Following the Danube to pause in Vienna, the third figure in our top 5 is Crown Prince Rudolf of the Habsburgs, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth. Behind the velvet of the court lay a youth scarred by wounds, bouts of drunkenness, and reckless affairs. The contagion turned the house of succession into a sealed room of despair. Step into mailing, where Rudolf's story touches the line between dynastic honor and painful truth. 3. Crown Prince Rudolf, Austria, Hungary, 1858, 1889. Rudolf was born in 1858. The son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth of Austria, raised amid radiant expectations of succession yet soaked in trauma. From childhood, he was separated from his sister Gisela at the age of 6, and years of study under an abusive tutor left marks not easily named. The palace child became an unstable man, drink as a lullaby, risky affairs as brief flights from a persistent sadness, a temperament hard to control like a small boat in a whirlpool, the rungs of ceremony, the lessons of statecraft. The audiences ablaze with light did not soothe the emptiness in his chest. He remained a Rudolf moving through velvet corridors whose eyes often missed the beat of joy. At 23, he married Princess Stephanie of Belgium when she was 17. Even during courtship and engagement, the moment that should have been the purest in a political marriage, Rudolf brought his current mistress to be introduced, as if to test how long the limits of forbearance could stretch. After their daughter was born, he grew cold, and the shared room cooled quickly. Dinners made more space for silence, and the glances they traded became fewer. As though neither still believed in the magic of a home, Stephanie, the young bride far from her homeland, gradually understood that she was a supporting character in her own story, where the leads were sudden revels and a nameless pain quietly growing in her husband's body. Then, disaster? Rudolf contracted gonorrhea and syphilis, two names that at the time were covered with a shroud of shame. He passed the disease to Stephanie. The doctors called it stomach flu, a gentle and misleading label, while the real consequence was the destruction of her fallopian tubes, leaving her permanently unable to bear children. From that day on, in a house already full of cracks, the drafts turned colder, wounded and humiliated. Stephanie refused the marriage bed and openly fell for a Polish count, a reflex to reclaim a little sovereignty over her own body. On the other side, Rudolf fell into despair. He begged his lover Mitzi Kasper to die with him, a plea signalling that the last doorway had run out of light. Mitzi refused and informed the police, but no one listened. The court's walls of honor were so thick and sleek that cries for help were swallowed in the carpeted corridors. When the path to rescue was sealed, Rudolf turned to the 17-year-old Baroness Mary Vetsera, who adored him with all the youth and blindness of a dreaming age, as a companion for his final escape. On the 30th of January, 1889, the two were found dead at the Mailing Lodge. Mary had been shot in the head. Rudolf took his own life a few hours later. Mary's body was handled secretly, carried away in a makeshift carriage, then buried among common graves. The court, with its familiar reflex for saving face, declared that Rudolf died of an aneurysm. But everyone understood the truth. Illness, frenzy, and despair had killed the empire's future. That truth, though covered by polite proclamations, still echoed through the cold stone halls. A young man, torn between duty and desire, let go when a sexually transmitted disease not only ravaged his body, but also snapped the last cords that tied him to life. And in the final click of Mailing's door, one could hear both the cracking of a line of succession, once thought hard as steel, and the falling pieces of a family story no one dared write in full. The model narrative sketches a brutal slide, from desire to infection, from pleasure to infertility, ending with a dim curtain call for the Habsburgs. At the beginning of the road were parties, flights into intoxication, affairs to fend off the ache in his chest. In the middle was a diagnosis called by another name, a wife robbed of fertility, a home growing cold that rituals could not warm. At the end was Mailing, the small room where truth proved stronger than velvet curtains. where a single shot not only ended 2 lives, but also placed a long comma in the story of an entire empire. Looking back over that stretch, no further plea is needed. The simple milestones already in the tale born amid expectations. Raised with trauma, married very young, infected and harming a spouse, begging for death, refused, then finding a companion for the end are enough to show a tragedy written in dark ink from the start. And when night finally closes, what remains is not the applause of ceremony, but a long silence in which listeners can place a hand on the chest, feel the breath quicken, and quietly understand how a single disease could lead a dynasty to the brink. Leaving Vienna and the echoes of Merling, we cross the Channel to Restoration London. The 4th figure in our top 5 is John Wilmot, the Earl of Rochester, a satirist and notorious rake under Charles II. Here, words sharp as a razor and endless nights of revelry form the backdrop for a disease that slips through pleasure. Step into a portrait where poetry, a quack doctor masquerade, and syphilis are tightly wound around a single life. 4. John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, England, 1647-1680. John Wilmot, 1647, inherited his title at only 11 years old. Taken under the wing of Charles II, amid a court being restored after upheaval, at 13, he entered Oxford, then travelled across Europe, absorbing Enlightenment ideas and perhaps a seed of illness. Returning to England at the king's urging, he pursued the wealthy heiress, Elizabeth Mallet. Her family fiercely opposed the match, and in a burst, both bold and reckless, he and his mother kidnapped the bride-to-be. The affair landed John Wilmot in the Tower of London, released. He rushed to the front in the Second Dutch War, returned a hero, married Elizabeth, and then had 4 children. But London called with all its lights and intoxication. He plunged back into the merry gang, a circle of nobles who lived to feast, treating night as day and pleasure as the air they breathed. There, a John Wilmot both gifted and daring emerged, enamoured of theatres, drinking tables, and pursuits that made the court's sense of honour wipe sweat from its brow. He adored the actress Nell Gwynn, who later became the king's mistress and championed Elizabeth Barry, a talented actress who was also his lover and the mother of his child. When Barry rose to fame, jealousy swelled like an undertow, pushing the relationship into turbulence. Amid that chaos, Wilmot's satirical verse flashed like a blade. Plays skewering society and court followed one after another. Once, he even mocked the king's sexual obsessions in front of the courtiers, and was banished a reminder that the line for free speech in a palace is thin as a thread. Pushed to the margins of power, he changed masks, becoming Dr. Bendo, a quack who treated infertility, sometimes even donning women's dress as Mrs. Bendo to examine ladies in private. Not a few of them later became pregnant, very likely with his children turning the medical tale into a bitter anecdote about disguise and desire. Behind the false doctor's mask, one sees an era tangled in belief, superstition, and lust. Behind the stage curtain, a poet using words both to attack and to defend himself against a life he could not resist. Those years forged a two-sided John Wilmot. On one side, the radiance of talent, a satiric laughter that could shatter every solemn mask. On the other, the abyss of debauchery. Nights without dawn, he moved through London like a flame, bright, hot, ungraspable, leaving behind the smell of drink, waves of laughter, and whispers that never died, but disease kept pace in silence. At 33, syphilis began to eat him away. Nasal collapse, blindness, urinary incontinence, a body falling to pieces like worm-eaten stage boards. All the pre-antibiotic cures: mercury, steaming, Harsh concoctions were mere sideshows. Weakening the body, without stopping the final curtain from slowly descending, John Wilmot's decline was not loud. It was like a snapped string in an empty room. Quick, painful, leaving a long hush. There. Verses once razor-sharp became shards of glass, reflecting a face that no longer recognized itself. In 1680, he died blind, exhausted, destroyed by the very disease he had scattered so prodigally. The crowds that once laughed at his barbs were gone. The revelling friends were scattered like ashes after a century's great banquet. What remained was a sad lesson. Brilliance cannot save a body torn by pleasure. Favour cannot light paths that desire has blurred. And a pen, however sharp, cannot sign a peace treaty with a sexually transmitted disease. The model closes this part like a lullaby of sorrow, brilliance and debauchery, favour and downfall. All end under the shadow of a disease that spares no one. At the crossroads of poetry and flesh, John Wilmot left a broken footprint. A man who lived to the fullest, wrote to the utmost, and burned out at full speed. And when the velvet finally fell, the question that rose was not about the boldness of his satire, but about the price of pleasure without a stop. For him, that price was a body burned out and a life ending far sooner than the flash of talent London once witnessed. Closing the journey through London, bright with lights and the scent of wine, we returned to Central Europe, where red wax seals on decrees could reshape the entire map of power. The final figure in our top 5 is Joseph I, Holy Roman Emperor, a young monarch of great ambition, devoted to pleasure, and ensnared by the disease that unsettled the Habsburg order of succession. Behind the parades and banquets is a bedroom door left ajar. Behind the treaties a fever, pounding headaches, and a belated promise. Step into a story where syphilis not only gnaws at a single body, but also draws an empire to the whirlpool's edge of a succession dispute. 5. Joseph I, Holy Roman Emperor, 1678, 1711. Born in 1678. Joseph, the eldest son of Emperor Leopold I, grew up amid expectations of succession, surrounded by a circle of progressive intellectuals and attentive beauties. From a very young age, he favoured pleasure, lavish parties and endless affairs. A rhythm of life measured more by music and flattery than by the discipline of governance. The rungs of ceremony seemed insufficient to anchor a spirit ever seeking sensation, and the court with its blazing banquets became the familiar backdrop for amorous adventures whispered along the corridors. At 21, the Queen Mother Wilhelmina, in the model's wording, resolved to tether the prince through marriage. She chose Wilhelmina Amalia of Brunswick-Lüneburg, who was 5 years older than Joseph. Before the wedding, Wilhelmina was required to undergo a fertility examination, a chilling reminder that for royal women the ultimate goal was to bear a male heir. Not to be loved, the splendid wedding opened like a perfect tableau, and happiness brushed by, only to vanish. Joseph quickly tired of monogamy, as if every vow at the altar were merely a thin veil thrown over a bottomless thirst. Each royal hunt for the young king became an occasion for his trusted count, Lambert, to prepare peasant girls for diversion. Noble women were likewise ready to join the whirl of pleasure. Countess Marianne Paley even became his official mistress, an unprecedented status that shocked a conservative Vienna. Even the Pope complained. Enraged, the Queen Mother threw the arranger into prison as a last disciplinary gesture still in her power. But from 1705, when Joseph ascended the throne, he became untouchable. The arms of power widened, and words of reproach were pushed behind the curtain of ceremony. Even so, the duty of producing an heir could not be deferred. Wilhelmina bore 3 children, including a prince named Leopold. The spark of hope had barely been lit before it went out. The boy died before his first birthday of hydrocephalus. The need for a male heir became more urgent than ever. Every nod of the courtiers and every church bell seemed to repeat a single objective: to bring forth a healthy prince to anchor the dynasty's future. Then disaster struck. Joseph contracted syphilis, rumoured to have come from the gardener's daughter, and he transmitted the disease to his wife, Wilhelmina, devout and naive. Believed it was an impurity within herself. She prayed unceasingly for a prince. But the illness had rendered her infertile. Whispered prayers could not reverse biological fact. The cracks in the marriage spread, and the royal family portrait had no space left for optimistic strokes. The Habsburg future had to pass to Joseph's brother Charles and his wife, Elizabeth. Fate did not smile. Their only son also died young, pushing Charles into peculiar remedies in hopes of changing his fortune. While the bedchamber still blazed with the cycle of pleasure, conquest, ennui, Joseph's political career was exhausted. For 6 years he struggled through the War of the Spanish Succession without securing a decisive victory. Added to this was the infamy of expelling the Romani, which further dimmed his governing image. Treaties barely dry were overshadowed by fevers, headaches, and a mind beginning to fray. At 32, Joseph entered his final decline. On his deathbed, he promised Wilhelmina that, if he survived, he would be faithful, a belated vow like a candle guttering in the wind. History gave him no chance to keep it. He died in 1711. Before that, he had signed an important agreement. Charles would succeed, and if Charles had no son, Joseph's daughters would inherit. However, Charles did not accept that reality. From there, a spark of conflict was placed beneath the seat of power. A clause meant to secure the bloodline collided with the will of the future ruler, and the first cracks in the order of succession began to echo through the stone walls. In the model text, Joseph's story appears as a slick downward slope, from pleasure to infection, from bedroom to affairs of state, from hopes of succession to the reality of infertility, ending with an early death and a consequential document packed with a fuse. Nothing needs to be embroidered. These milestones suffice to outline the price a court pays when its leader retreats into pleasure and hides medical truth behind velvet. At the bottom of the incline, syphilis does more than gnaw a single body. It hollows out the will to rule, breaks the chain of decision, and drags an entire empire to the whirlpool's edge of a succession dispute where a small clause can tilt the entire map of power. When the door at Merling closes and the echoes of Rudolf sink away, one figure still stands at the margins of the story: Princess Stephanie of Belgium. Where the ceremonial lights go dark, she steps forward as the quiet witness to a medical lie, stomach flu, that covered the real wound, a body betrayed, and the possibility of motherhood taken away. If Rudolf collapsed under despair and scandal, then Stephanie is the quiet, lingering aftermath, where pain has no stage and justice has no audience. Let us leave the noise of the court and move a breath closer to hear the story of the woman history pushed to the edges, the invisible victim of words so gentle they became cruel. 6. Princess Stephanie of Belgium, the invisible victim of a medical lie. Married at 17 to a 23-year-old crown prince who was unstable and debauched, Stephanie entered marriage as if stepping into a palace of many locked doors. Beautiful, dazzling, yet growing steadily colder after the birth of her daughter. The chill arrived not in words but in empty chairs at dinner, glances out of sync, long nights without a presence. Then disaster struck. Rudolf contracted both gonorrhea and syphilis, and the path of the disease did not end with his body. It crossed the boundary of the bedchamber and slipped quietly to his wife. At that moment, instead of the candor medicine, requires, Stephanie was given a label as gentle as it was cruel: stomach flu. The phrase was like a silk scarf laid over a festering wound, soothing to the ear, but strangling the patient's right to know. The real consequence was anything but gentle. Her fallopian tubes were destroyed. The door to childbearing closed while she was still very young. Betrayed by her spouse, harmed by disease, and stripped of the mission to bear a prince, Stephanie withdrew from the marital bed and openly fell for a Polish count as a way to reclaim the barest sovereignty over her own body. It was not loud defiance, but a quiet choice, to set a boundary and hand back to the court the mould of a role it had pressed onto her. What followed was no longer private. Rudolf's despair, his attempt to draw another into death, and then Mayerling all exposed a silent architecture surrounding sexually transmitted disease within the royal house. When collective honour is placed above medical truth and a wife's right to safety, there, diagnoses are called by other names. There, the victim is pushed out of frame. There, face-saving matters more than the body. Thus Stephanie appears not as a dim supporting figure, but as the centre of bodily consequence, where every act of concealment leaves a sharp mark on a human life. Seen from that angle, Rudolf's tragedy has two layers: the explosive layer of the husband and the low, sustained layer of the wife. The second layer has no gunshot and no shattering proclamation, yet it weighs as much as the rest of a life lived with a scar never called by its right name. From this, Stephanie's story becomes a lesson in the visibility of power and the invisibility of the victim. Power has regalia, medals, chronicles, and eulogies. The victim has only a medical file swapped out by words. When medical truth is wrapped in the banner of saving face, the one who pays first and longest is not the court, but the woman suspended between duty and dignity. This section does not seek a noisy indictment. It simply invites the listener to lower their voice, to look past jade and brocade, and to see a young woman serving a life sentence because of her spouse's fault and of lies, wearing the physician's cloak. After Rudolf, grant a moment of silence for Stephanie, to call her pain by its right name, and to understand how a single, seemingly harmless phrase can alter the fate of an entire life. Leaving the quiet set aside for Stephanie, we return to Vienna, where murmured prayers before a small altar drown out the clamour of banquets. Here, the next figure steps forward: Queen Wilhelmina, Amalia of Brunswick, Lüneburg, consort of Joseph I. If Stephanie is the invisible victim of a medical lie, then Wilhelmina, Amalia, is the silent shadow of duty, entering marriage after a cold fertility examination, living amid the expectation of bearing a prince and within rituals that do not allow pain to be called by its true name. When the illness slipped through the bedroom door, she believed it was an impurity within herself and prayed for a miracle only to receive, in return, the unfillable emptiness of infertility and a wavering order of succession. Follow Wilhelmina Amalia to see how an injured body can make the very throne tremble. T. Queen Wilhelmina Amalia of Brunswick-Lüneburg, consort of Joseph I. Wilhelmina Amalia emerges as the very image of a devout, orderly, and patient queen. And precisely for that reason, the tragedy sinks deeper. She entered marriage with Joseph I after a chilly examination of her fertility, then quietly fulfilled every convention, honouring God, keeping the household in order, softening the sharp edges of ceremony. She bore 3 children and seemed to be walking a carpeted path of duty. But fragile joy did not linger. The early death of Prince Leopold drove the pressure of succession to its limit. Every prayer from the ladies in waiting, every murmur beneath the chapel vaults, weighed with a single wish: a healthy boy to pin down the dynasty's future outline. Meanwhile, beyond the glass frame of piety, the king's private life began to show cracks. Amid revels, and through the services arranged by Lambert, Joseph I contracted syphilis and carried the seed of illness back to the bedroom, unaware of the source. Wilhelmina Amalia, like so many devout women of her time, turned the arrow of blame upon herself. She read the vague symptoms, as an impurity to be cleansed with prayer, and begged for a miracle, a prince to redeem the house. The miracle did not come. The disease silently severed the path to childbearing, rendering her infertile at a young age, and slammed shut the mission the court had placed upon her body since the day she was brought in as a bride. From Wilhelmina's vantage, the portrait of power reveals a familiar paradox. Royal women treated as succession devices, they must be healthy, must bear children, must keep the bloodline running, yet they are not protected from the risks of infection that come from the very man who wears the crown. When hope ran dry, the burden of succession shifted to Charles and Elizabeth. They wandered into bizarre regimens, hanging paintings of muscular male deities to spark the imagination, forcing a diet of liquor and rich foods to fortify. The outcome was only alcoholism, a heavy body, and cradles filled with daughters. In those chambers crowded with paintings, one does not see medical knowledge, only bewilderment dressed in ritual. One does not hear honest diagnosis, only the whisper of faith trying to bend reality. Amid the cycles of ceremony, Wilhelmina Amalia kept living to a slow rhythm, crossing herself in the morning, hearing petitions at noon, fingering the rosary at night. She learned to fold her pain beneath layers of velvet and brocade, to smile before officials, to stand beside her husband at reviews where no one uttered the name of the disease that had quietly determined their private lives. Each time the church bells tolled, she remembered the prince she had lost. Each time the ladies offered felicitations, she heard, as if from the palace walls, a hollow tapping. For here, face-saving mattered more than truth, and truth, when called by another name, always comes back to collect its debt from the weakest. Wilhelmina Amalia's story has no noisy climax. It sounds like a wistful lullaby. Prayer in place of treatment, paintings in place of science, and an empire beginning to crack from an invisible sore on a woman's body. If Joseph I was the whirlwind of passion that rocked the throne, then Wilhelmina was the silent lake, reflecting the deeper ripples where power and piety meet, and yet cannot save an infected body or a heart bowed under the weight of duty. Wilhelmina's story shows that when medical truth is obscured, a woman's body becomes the instrument of succession's ambition. That mechanism does not end in Vienna. In Isfahan under Abbas II, it swelled into an entire system where power and pleasure intertwined, opening a hidden road for disease to spread. Leaving Vienna, we come to Isfahan, where silence is no longer the fate of a single wife, but the rule of an entire forbidden court. The harem of Abbas II operates like a body administrative machine. Women's bodies are recruited, allocated, and controlled to serve the ruler's prestige and desire. When pleasure is put on the payroll as procedure, disease becomes a hidden cost, dense contact, on-way power, medicine standing behind incense. Thus, by the year 1666, the late-stage signs on Abbas II himself were not only the tragedy of one body, but the echo of that tightly sealed structure. Abbas II's harem, not just one infected body. With Abbas II, the story does not name each sick person, but it plants a chilling assumption in the listener's ear. Some historians suspect the harem was infected as well. His harem comprised many concubines, most of them women seized from conquered territories, brought into the palace as part of the spoils and arranged within a tightly sealed order. There, women's bodies existed as a resource under court control, recruited, assigned to quarters, ranked, logged in and out. Every step fell within protocol. Every breath belonged to a will above. When power takes hold of the timetable of the body, pleasure ceases to be impulse and becomes discipline, and silence becomes the only safety rule. In that world, Abbas II slid through banquets, wine, and love, Night music poured over the tiled courtyards like an endless lullaby. But behind the music lay a cold reality. Sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis had all the conditions to spread quietly. High contact density gave the pathogen constant shelter. Absolute power imbalance meant complaints found no ears. Proper medical care was pushed behind the curtain of incense and ritual. So symptoms were often called by harmless names. In such a mechanism, disease does not appear as a sudden calamity, but as a fee collected regularly in the dark. Each royal revel was a smoothly running loop. Selection, preparation, reception, then oblivion. The harem, with corridors linking like a maze, resembled a body administrative machine in which people gradually became infrastructure. When pleasure is placed on the roster as procedure, disease naturally turns into a hidden cost. No one writes the figures in the ledgers. No one steps forward to take the blame. There are only fevers that pass. Sores hidden under powder. Long aching nights muffled by the scent of sandalwood. By the year 1666, when late-stage signs appeared clearly on Abbas II himself, it was no longer the story of a single body collapsing. It was the echo of an entire sealed structure that had nourished risk for many years. A darkened brow, a postponed decision, a court session without the king. These small fragments assembled into a larger picture. The system had come to collect its debt. And like every other debt, the interest rate on silence is always higher than one imagines. This section offers the listener before sleep a broader frame. An empire may be shrewd enough to avoid war with the Ottoman, may find temporary victories over the Mughal or Russia, but it can scarcely defeat biological truth when the power mechanism turns pleasure into a system and medicine is kept in the rear to serve face-saving. Political reason may draw clean lines on a map, but the human body always keeps its own laws, and when those laws are slighted, the map will, sooner or later, pucker with creases. A gentle sense of waking from a dream arrives. Royal night music cannot drown out the whisper of disease. The golden sheen of jeweled cups cannot hide the cracks where public health is being neglected. The thick incense cannot dispel the metallic smell of truth. One can picture half-closed windows, figures passing like water, and, at the end, a string of quickened breaths. No chronicle records. If the harem did indeed have people who were infected, they disappeared nameless in the handwritten pages. No genealogy. No edict. No eulogy. They exist only as faint dots on the diagram of power, anonymous victims of a sealed structure where power and pleasure are tightly entwined. And medicine is merely the dim shadow behind ritual. That shadow follows every step. But no one turns back to look. Seen from Isfahan, Wilhelmina Amalia's story in Vienna suddenly gains another layer of meaning. If in Vienna the tragedy of a wife was wrapped in prayers and propriety, then in Isfahan it widened into a collective tragedy, administered by procedure and silence. At both ends of the continent, in two different courts, the same logic holds. When face-saving is placed above medical truth, the body. First and foremost, the woman's body becomes the site that bears all consequences. Therefore, when you close your eyes to the slow telling, notice which sounds remain. Not the clink of cups, not the singing and dancing, but the very small sound of a system cracking from an invisible saw along a long corridor to the room where the king sits alone. There, the question is no longer who erred at a single banquet, but how the entire machine has operated so that disease became destiny. And when that question arises, sleep grows heavy. For the answer, though still unnamed, already lies within the structure. Foreshadows of the age: smallpox, consumption, cholera, and typhoid. And just as that question settles like a pebble in water, we step back a pace from the closed rooms to take in the wider backdrop of the age. Out there, illness did not mean syphilis alone. Cities bright with lights and palaces scented with incense breathed the same air. Where smallpox left, pockmarks beneath powder. The consumption shortened the breath beneath church vaults. Cholera rode the hot waters of summer, and typhoid smouldered through barracks, kitchens, and ledger rooms. This is not to assign more diseases to anyone in our story, but to understand that every private tragedy drifted in a larger river, where pathogens travelled with ceremony, with music, with silence. From here, we will gently open the next 4 sections: smallpox, consumption, cholera, then typhoid, 4 familiar shadows of the century, to see more clearly the backdrop upon which syphilis chose its own path, hidden under silk, moving along corridors, and shaking the entire lineage. Smallpox, cold night, candle burn. The scent of camphor slips through the heavy drapes like a wordless prayer. On the dressing table, a fine white powder lies evenly, soft as mist, but beneath it are tiny scars, neat as grains of sand, the quiet emblem of an age when smallpox passed without knocking. In carpeted corridors, silk gloves rustle, hems brush the walls, and voices fall softer than usual, as if volume itself could fan a fever into flame. Smallpox was the stubborn guest of many centuries, arriving by season, leaving by season, sweeping through palace and marketplace alike, and tracing behind it a map of rashes gone dry. Ceremony, trumpets. The ritual of bows could not halt the crimson specks that rose on the skin, just as incense could not drown the warm smell of liniments in shuttered rooms. When the sickness called, the body began with a wave of fatigue. Then a sorrowing fever like grey clouds clinging long to a dome. The rash erupted, ripened, and crusted. Attendants learned to change sheets as lightly as lifting an unfinished dream. Those who survived wore scars, small dots scattered over the cheeks, the temples, sometimes even the eyelids, like a private calendar engraved into skin. Some lived on, but their gaze was forever altered. Darkness, claiming half the life that remained. Beauty, marriage, social standing, all were stamped by marks that chose no favoured place. In the mirror, some stepped back to avoid the light. In the street, some lowered the brim of a hat, hoping the wind of life would slow by a beat or two, so they could catch breath with a newly written fate. Before antibiotics, people met it with what lay at hand. Aromatics burned for warmth, hearths glowing deep into the night, thick blankets layered as if to bar the path of cold air. Isolation was practiced by instinct more than rule. A door kept shut, a tray set at the threshold. A few notes slipped through a crack. Later, in some places, crude variolation appeared like a wager of its time, risking the small to avoid the great, yet danger stood, waiting at every doorway. In every choice, the sick body was blotting paper, drinking in both the hopes and the fears of those nearby. In the world of court ritual, language was another balm. Bulletins went out in gentle script, a slight indisposition, no audiences. In need of rest, honour took precedence over medical candour. Truth, dressed in ceremonial garments, seemed less thorny, even as the fever outside still scorched the long nights. Thus we see quiet intervals spread across the reception calendar, and banquets postponed not for weather, but for an illness that had entered the house on a draught. Along the path we have walked, the picture rises in scents and sounds. In Lisbon, the court's powder recalls old pockmarks, a whisper from a time no one could escape. In London, the theatre mingles spectators who have survived smallpox, some veiled, some laughing softly applause, still sounding though a few hands bear pale scars. Vienna keeps a measured distance between chapel and sick room, where prayer ascends, while the smell of ointment tethers the patient to the earth. Isfahan carries sandalwood that muffles coughs. Yet the cough still marks a restless night in a servant's duty log. Images and sounds interlace, the rustle of silk gloves, the tap of a spoon against a medicine bowl, silhouettes, avoiding one another's eyes in narrow halls. Some greetings are shortened, some footsteps try to fall as softly as possible, as if gentleness could pluck a few thorns from the illness. And amid it all, the mirror still reflects an unspoken truth. Smallpox leaves its signature on the skin like a red seal, with its ink gone dry. But there is a disease that leaves no scar on the skin. It cuts straight into the lungs and the breath. Consumption. Pulmonary tuberculosis. A thin mist of morning clings to the air. Church bells tolling slowly like a hand, gently touching the atmosphere. Someone kneels, eyelids lowered, and just as the prayer still rests on the tip of the tongue, a deep cough from the pews behind cleaves the words in two. That cough lasts longer than a single bell stroke, leaving a dry echo beneath the cold stone vault, as if the entire city were breathing with riddled lungs. In crowded houses, where the common kitchen smells of coal and laundry never quite dries, consumption passes without an introduction. In barracks, among bunks set close together, it borrows sleep to slip into breath. In the theatre, in the pause between applause, one can hear a brief rattle of a dry cough. Long winters, with wind threading the cracks of doors, turn the cough into the city's background music. No one wants to remember it, yet everyone knows it by heart. The illness begins with small, nameless fatigues. The body thins like a shadow whose edges the wind has pared away. The low fever is not loud, only persistent, like a reminder that will not leave. At night, sweat beads up, dampening the collar and the pillow's edge, forcing the patient to sit up and catch breath, as if just swum across a cold river. The cough stretches on, taking each day a sliver of speech, a measure of strength. An appointment already written down. Work breaks off. Ceremonies are missed. Audiences are postponed. Reviews see fewer shoulders standing side by side. Even hands folded in prayer at the chapel grow loose with fatigue. In the pre-antibiotic age, people fought it with lessons passed by word of mouth. Seek a warmer climate. Move to a place with less fog. Convalesce in a valley of sunlight. Drink milk. Eat eggs to regain strength. Some advised bloodletting to lower the heat. Some burned alcohol along the ribcage like a rite of exorcism. Yet these measures were like thin wooden boats on heavy seas. Much pain, little effect, and often only further exhaustion. Amid uncertain remedies, hope was portioned out into spoonfuls of broth, cups of warm milk, and quiet noons spent listening to sunlight inch across the floor. Language helped to soften things as well. Instead of naming it plainly, people said debility, winter weariness, in need of rest. Such phrasing was like a cloth laid on a fevered brow, cool for a moment, but powerless to lower the heat within. There were even times when the illness was romanticized as the artist's disease, growing thin as refinement. A soft cough as sensibility, dark circles as the sign of a great soul. These gauzy notions slowed the steps of isolation, lengthening the crooked road toward truth. Across our story's map, we hear the cough in many places. In Vienna, it scores the background to a wife's solitude as she sits before a small altar, fingering her rosary to pass a long night. In John Wilmot's London, between revels and laughter, one can still catch a broken cadence of breathing at the end of a corridor when the lamps are lowered. Lisbon keeps the habit of warming a brazier in the library, as if that heat could hold on to a conversation growing thin, and Isfahan, behind heavy curtains, chooses silence, letting the cough dissolve into sandalwood and the soft pluck of strings. Images and sounds stitch the scene together. a cup of warm milk set on a checked cloth, a handkerchief marked with a cough, folded neatly like a secret no one wishes to open, a window only slightly ajar to let cold sunlight in, drawing a thin line on the tiles. From time to time, the patient looks out, counting the motes rising, as if counting the breaths that remain. Consumption leaves no scars on the skin, as smallpox does, but it etches faint lines across a life's rhythm, slower, shorter, more broken. It teaches one to hear one's own breathing, to recognize the fragility of a ribcage once thought solid as seasoned wood, and precisely because it is quiet yet tenacious, it turns each day into a weary watch. But there is a disease that does not wear one down slowly. It surges in with the water like a flood. Cholera. Cholera? Summer presses down like a heavy blanket over the city. The smell of stagnant water rises from underground drains, and wooden barrels left on the porch, both rank and musty, holding back the feet of passers-by. In the alley, the creak of water yokes sounds out, each step as if carrying a quiet piece of bad news. A shopkeeper pauses for a beat to look into a cloudy basin, then bows the head again as if the surface could be coaxed back to clarity. Under that panting heat, everyone feels a drier throat, a quicker heartbeat, and an invisible fear threading into the morning greetings. Cholera always travels with dirty water and patchwork hygiene. A crowded marketplace, a cramped barracks, or even a lively banquet can become a flashpoint. It needs no great wind. A single stream coursing through narrow lanes is enough to lay down invisible footprints. On hot days, water scooped in haste, a shared dipper, hands not yet washed all become little bridges for the pathogen to cross. And while people are still busy laughing and talking, the microbe has already slipped into the everyday noise, waiting for a convenient moment to raise its voice. Symptoms arrive like a steep flood. Nausea surge, fierce and sudden. Then come bouts of diarrhea that dehydrate the body so quickly the hands turn papery dry. Someone robust yesterday can collapse within a day. On the streets, hawkers' cries dwindle, shops close earlier, carriages grow sparse. People peer at one another through door cracks, timid, as if night had poured into the middle of day. Indoors, the patient lies, still, lips cracked, eyes sunken, hands trembling amid damp cloths changed again and again. Every time the body is lifted, another wave breaks against a fragile shore. Before antibiotics, responses were only what people passed along to one another. Astringents, concentrated herbal decoctions, hot steam to expel poison, advice to avoid raw foods, to limit fishy fare, to boil drinking water, isolation loose and guided more by instinct than by rules. Understanding of water sources remained dim as an unlit dead end. People only knew to huddle in, tread softly, speak gently, and set another pot of boiled water on the stove, like placing a whispered prayer. Each spoon of thin broth, each sip of warm water dripping into a dry throat, became a fragile count against the hot, restless air. Language, as usual, went ahead of truth to shield it. People called it a stomach upset, digestive disturbance, avoiding the word epidemic, as one avoids looking a storm straight in the eye. Fear easily swelled into panic, and when panic swept through, official news grew even hazier, floating like smoke in a sultry afternoon. Thus the notices chose gentle phrasing, hoping to preserve calm while, in the back courtyard, the sound of basins still clanged together. Along our narrative's thread, we see familiar reflexes in the capitals. In Lisbon, rumours of cholera once draped the palace like a hot mist, slowing the servants' steps and prompting water urns to be changed again and again. Vienna tightened banquet ritual. Glasses poured more sparingly. Tables cleared in haste. Windows opened a little wider to change the wind's direction. Isfahan burned more incense, hoping the scent of sandalwood would cover the unease flowing along tiled corridors. London tried to laugh on stage, but backstage, basins and towels were set out as an unwritten right. Images and sounds in those days were as steady as a breathing exercise. A basin placed beside the bed, a towel neatly wrung over the rim of a bowl. The kitchen door barred earlier than usual. Hurried footsteps on brick corridors. Whispers slipping through door cracks. The light tap of a spoon against a cup to call the sick back for a sip of warm water. Everyone learned to move slowly, speak softly, and keep just enough distance not to wake the wave lying still beneath the surface. Even when the water settles, one shadow of illness still follows soldiers and kitchen hands in silence. Typhoid. Typhoid fever. Steady rain. The roof tiles seemed to breathe slow beads of water, and laundry hung out to dry, only grows damper and more pungent. Ledgers in the administrative offices scribble a quick note, absent with seasonal flu. But the lingering fever speaks up in protest. This is no passing chill. The air hangs heavy like a wet cloth across the shoulders. And in every crowded house, every barracks packed with bunk beds, every solemn corridor of the palace, a nameless unease travels with the hollow knock of rain on the sill. Typhoid most often follows contaminated water and food. It chooses places where bodies press close. Lodging houses, army camps, communal kitchens, the women's quarters within the court, a shared water tub, a pot of soup reheated from the day before, a basket of greens rinsed in a cloudy basin. Any of these can form a small bridge for the pathogen to cross. In the barracks, roll call thins without warning. In the market, a porter's hands tremble as he looks into a bowl of thin gruel. In the inner kitchens, a cook bows over each water jar as if reading an indictment. No great catastrophe is required. A single loose link in the chain of hygiene is enough to open the door for the fever to wander in. Symptoms rise like mercury in a glass. A high fever that holds on. A face flushed then rubber-legged. A headache that hammers steadily at the temples. Digestive upheaval that makes the stomach reject every dish. The patient is spent. Sleep shatters into short fragments that slide across a damp brow. The schedule falls apart. A long-planned audience is missed. A performance once thought immovable is postponed. Even the hour of reading the last comfort is lost. Each morning a cool, damp cloth is changed and set on the sill. Each noon the faint clink of a spoon against a bowl of broth sounds like a reminder to a weary soul to try one sip. The days lengthen even as the body curls in, slight as a shadow under the eaves in rain. In the pre-antibiotic era, the response was as meagre as a storm-season medicine chest. Cold compresses to push back the flame of fever. Rest to conserve strength. Thin broth to coax a less rebellious stomach. At times poultices were laid on the belly. Warmth passed along the ribs as if a rite could soothe the cramp. Elsewhere, bloodletting was tried, the belief being that drawing blood would draw off heat. Results were limited and depended on the body's reserves. Some pulled through by stubborn endurance. Some faded despite following every instruction. In the soaking rain, my hope was as slight as a lampset far from the wind flickering, yet still trying to burn. And as ever, language ran ahead of truth to pitch a little tent of calm. A chill, internal heat, gentle phrases that hid the risk of contagion and delayed public health decisions for fear of injuring prestige. That caution made every measure arrive a half-beat late. Bulletins were weighed more by protocol than by temperature. In the murky interval, the patient lay listening to the rain and to whispers at the threshold, counting a pulse the way one counts the drops on a roof. Across our story's thread, each familiar capital shows its reflex. Lisbon falls quiet after a harsh summer, as if still shadowed by water jars changed again and again amid rumour. Vienna sometimes adds a dry line, absent from affairs of state. leaving chairs empty at audiences and ceremonies. London postpones a performance, the hall closing early, applause bunching up like a helpless promise. Isfahan ends the music sooner than usual, letting the rain stitch the sky shut, while the scent of herbs in the kitchen mingles with the hot tang of sweat in the inner rooms. Images and sounds keep the day's rhythm in the rain. A cool browcloth changed again and again, the tap of a spoon on a bowl with each invitation to sip another mouthful, the steam of herbs blending with the smell of fevered skin, quiet footsteps along the corridor so as not to wake a headache curled tight. Such plain things become the background music of endurance. No crescendo, no drums, only the long, slow tempo of patience and weariness. 4 names: smallpox, consumption, cholera, typhoid are only the backdrop. Upon it, syphilis still takes its own path, hidden beneath silk, stepping into the bedchamber and shaking the entire lineage. Reaching the end of this journey, we realize the video does not merely recount 5 names linked to syphilis. It also opens a door that looks straight at the truth. Power can erect ritual. Gilding can burnish history. But biology does not wear ceremonial dress. Beneath silk and powder, human beings, whether kings, queens, or poets, are equally vulnerable. We have seen a scholar king fade in silence, a Safavid monarch slide between pleasures, a crown prince fall from intoxication into despair, a gifted Earl driven, at once, by fame and by disease, a young emperor die early, leaving succession disputes behind. At the same time, we have also looked at faces seldom named, a wife infected and stripped of the ability to be a mother, a devout empress turned into a succession device, concubines made collective victims of a machine that fused pleasure with power. The greatest value of this story is the courage to call things by their proper names, to call illness an illness, pain a pain, rather than stomach flu, debility. No audiences, when language muzzles truth, the body will speak in harsher ways. The second lesson is the equality of fragility. A crown does not exempt anyone from infection, depression, or loneliness. Third, power cannot substitute for medical care. Wherever pleasure hardens into procedure, disease becomes a hidden cost. Wherever face outweighs truth, public health decisions arrive a half-beat late. And fourth, women's bodies must be respected as subjects, not tools for bloodlines or walls to hide another's fault. From these distant slices of time, we see the present more clearly. Stigma always worsens illness. Silence always lengthens the tunnel. What we learn is not to judge the past, but to practice compassion and medical honesty today. Speak plainly, seek care early, treat thoroughly, respect the other person, and keep one another safe. History also reminds us to stay alert before every pretty word. A gentle phrase can cost more than a clear diagnosis. A flawless ritual can conceal a system already cracking. If we had to lull it down to a few bedtime lines, this is a story of shadows: syphilis, smallpox, consumption, cholera, typhoid moving through corridors of power, and of small people trying to make their way through that darkness. When we understand the shadow, we know how to turn the lamp. When we can turn the lamp, toxic secrets have less room to live. Thank you for coming all the way here. If you are still awake, take a deep breath and think of one kind thing you can do for yourself or someone else, a checkup you can schedule, a message you can send, a truth you can say at the right time. Then close your eyes. The stories will lie still. What remains is an even breath and a small promise. Tomorrow, we will choose light over the velvet curtain.